They say blood is thicker than water, but nobody warns you that sometimes blood is also more poisonous than any enemy you'll ever face. I stood in my billionaire grandfather's library, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and first-edition books worth more than most people's homes, and watched my own cousin point her finger at me and say the word that would change everything. Thief. The shocking part? My entire family nodded in agreement, like they'd been waiting for someone to finally say it out loud. I couldn't believe this was happening. That the people who'd raised me, who'd shared holidays and memories, and supposedly loved me, were publicly destroying my character while the funeral lilies were barely gone. But here's the secret they didn't know. The truth that was caught on camera and about to be revealed in the most devastating way possible. The real thief wasn't me, and the conspiracy they'd built to steal my inheritance was about to collapse so spectacularly that even I didn't see it coming. What happened next didn't just expose who'd lied and who'd cheated. It exposed something far darker about what happens when love becomes currency, and family becomes a business transaction where the highest bidder wins. Or so they thought. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. There I was, standing in that library. The temperature always set too cold. Just how Grandpa liked it. While Mr. Caldwell prepared to read my grandfather's will. Grandpa had 2 children. My father, Richard, and my Aunt Margaret. Brittany was Margaret's daughter. The mahogany shelves loomed around us, and suddenly my cousin Brittany pointed her manicured finger at me and said the word that would shatter everything. Thief. The room went dead silent, like someone had pressed pause on reality itself, and every single pair of eyes turned to me with this mix of shock and something worse. Validation. Like they'd been waiting for someone to finally say it out loud. My hands started shaking, not from fear, but from this crushing humiliation that felt like drowning in front of people who were supposed to love me. It wasn't just an accusation. It was a public execution disguised as family drama, and I was the one they'd all agreed to sacrifice. The truth is, I'd walked into that mansion thinking grief was the reason we were all gathered, but the air felt wrong from the second I stepped inside. My father wouldn't look at me directly. My aunt kept whispering to Brittany, the golden child who'd always gotten everything she wanted, and even my younger brother Ethan seemed like he'd been briefed on something I wasn't supposed to know about. When Brittany called me a thief, she didn't just say it, she performed it, her voice dripping with this fake concern like she was so hurt by my supposed betrayal. "Grandpa trusted you," she said, shaking her head slowly, "and you backstabbed him when he was most vulnerable." I opened my mouth to defend myself, but my father cut me off with a look so cold it could have frozen hell itself. What shocked me most wasn't the accusation. It was how quickly everyone else fell in line. My aunt nodded like she'd suspected it all along. Uncle James, Margaret's husband who followed her lead like a shadow, crossed his arms with this smug, "I knew it" expression, and even the cousins I used to play with as a kid just stared at me like I was suddenly a stranger who'd cheated her way into their family. Nobody asked for my side. Nobody questioned Brittany's story. Nobody even hesitated before deciding I was guilty. It was like they'd rehearsed this moment, like my role as the villain had been written long before I ever walked through those mahogany doors. The walls of that library, lined with books my grandfather loved, suddenly felt like they were closing in. A beautiful cage where my dignity was being stripped away piece by piece. I stood there, frozen, feeling shamed in a way I didn't know was possible, while Brittany continued building her case. "We all know she was the only one who had access to his private study," she said, her voice rising with manufactured emotion. "And now precious family heirlooms are missing. Things that were supposed to be passed down. Things with real value." The way she said "value" made my stomach turn, because I knew exactly what she meant. Money. Always money. The only language this family seemed to speak fluently anymore. We'd buried him weeks ago, but the grief was still raw, and already they were circling like vultures, more concerned about what they'd inherit than the man we'd lost. But what killed me, what absolutely destroyed me in that moment, was realizing they didn't see me as family anymore. I'd become something else in their eyes. An obstacle, a threat, someone who needed to be removed from the equation so they could claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. The karma of it all felt crushing because I'd been the one who actually showed up for Grandpa, who sat with him on lonely Sunday afternoons, who listened to his stories when everyone else was too busy. Yet here I was, labeled a thief. And the worst part? They wanted me to feel it, to wear that shame like a scarlet letter. As Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat to continue reading, I realized this wasn't just about missing heirlooms. This was about something much bigger, something that had been building beneath the surface of our so-called loving family for years. The library wasn't just a room, it was a stage, and every single person in my family knew their lines perfectly. Crystal chandeliers hung above us like silent witnesses, casting shadows across leather-bound books that probably cost more than most people's cars, and the Persian rug beneath our feet was so expensive you could practically feel the price tag with every step. This was supposed to be a place of mourning, a sacred moment where we honored the man who'd built this empire from nothing. But instead, it felt like opening night of the cruelest play ever written. The grief everyone wore on their faces looked rehearsed, practiced, like they'd stood in front of mirrors that morning asking themselves, how sad should I look to seem believable? I watched my aunt dab at dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, and it hit me. In this family, love had always been currency, and right now, everyone was trying to cash in. My grandfather's portrait hung on the wall behind Mr. Caldwell's desk, and I couldn't stop staring at it, searching those painted eyes for answers he could no longer give me. He looked proud in that painting, dignified, wearing the same navy suit he'd worn to my college graduation, the only family member who'd actually shown up. The betrayal of this moment felt so much heavier because Grandpa had warned me, hadn't he? They'll smile while they sharpen their knives, sweetheart, he'd told me once while we shared tea on his veranda. And when the time comes, they won't hesitate to use them. I'd laughed it off back then, thought he was being dramatic. But standing in this cold mansion, watching my own father refuse to defend me, I finally understood what he meant. The air itself felt transactional, like every breath we took was calculated, measured, weighed against potential inheritance. Brittany sat with perfect posture, her designer dress probably chosen specifically for this occasion. Black, of course, but with just enough style to show she was still young, still relevant, still worthy of Grandpa's fortune. My uncle kept checking his Rolex, barely hiding his impatience, while my aunt whispered something to her husband that made him smirk. This wasn't family drama. This was a business meeting disguised as a funeral, and I was apparently the agenda item they all wanted to resolve quickly. The humiliation of being called a thief stung, sure, but what really hurt was realizing that to them, I'd never been family at all, just competition. Mr. Caldwell, the family attorney, sat at the head of that massive oak table like a judge overseeing an informal court, and maybe that's exactly what this was. His wire-rimmed glasses caught the light as he organized his papers with deliberate slowness, and I wondered if he saw what I saw. The masks everyone wore, the performance of sorrow that didn't reach anyone's eyes. "Shall we continue?" he asked, his voice carrying this weight that suggested he knew far more than he was letting on. Nobody answered. They just leaned forward slightly, like predators catching a scent. I'd walked into this room thinking I was attending a will reading, but the truth was so much darker. This was a takedown, carefully orchestrated, and somehow I'd become the target without ever knowing there was a war being waged. What shocked me most was how seamlessly they'd transformed grief into greed, how quickly the loss of a man became the gain of his possessions. Grandpa had built this empire with his bare hands, worked 70-hour weeks, sacrificed relationships and health to create something that would last beyond him. And this circus of accusations and barely concealed contempt, was his legacy. I thought about all those Sunday afternoons I'd spent with him, listening to his stories about starting with nothing, about the dignity of hard work, about how real wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the people who'd stand by you when everything else fell apart. He'd been testing them, I realized, testing all of us. And as I looked around that beautiful, soulless library, I understood that most of his family had already failed long before this moment. The memories hit me like a freight train right there in that cold library. Flashbacks of every single Sunday I'd spent with Grandpa while everyone else had more important things to do. I'd show up at his mansion around 10 in the morning with fresh pastries from the bakery he loved, the one 3 towns over that nobody else bothered to visit anymore, and he'd greet me at the door with that smile that made his whole face crinkle up like wrapping paper. We'd sit in his study, the same study Brittany now claimed I'd robbed, and he'd tell me stories about building his business, about the people who'd betrayed him along the way, about how success reveals who people really are beneath their polished surfaces. "You're the only one who shows up just to show up," he'd told me once, squeezing my hand with fingers that had grown fragile but still held so much strength. "Not because you want something, but because you care." I couldn't believe how different those Sundays felt compared to the occasional family gatherings where everyone else would appear. During holidays, they'd descend on the mansion like it was a networking event, air-kissing Grandpa's cheeks while simultaneously appraising the artwork on his walls, mentally calculating their future inheritance with every glance. My father would talk loudly about his latest business ventures, trying to impress a man who'd already built an empire before Dad was even born. Brittany would take endless selfies in front of the grand staircase, posting them with captions about family legacy and blessed, but she never stayed longer than the meal required. My aunt would compliment the chef, the decor, the wine selection, everything except the man who'd provided it all. They loved what Grandpa represented, the status and wealth, but they didn't love him. Not really. Not the way you love someone whose company you actually enjoy. The truth was, Grandpa needed help with simple things that his pride wouldn't let him ask the staff to do. I'd help him organize his desk because his eyesight wasn't what it used to be, sort through mail that had piled up, update his computer when technology confused him. We'd work on crossword puzzles together, and he'd pretend to struggle with answers I knew he already had just to make me feel useful. "Your cousin called yesterday," he mentioned once, casual as anything. Asked if I'd thought about updating my will. Wanted to make sure everyone was taken care of fairly. The way he said it, with this knowing sadness, told me everything about what he really thought of her concern. But I never pushed, never asked about inheritance or money. Those Sundays weren't transactions. They were just time, just presence, just love in its simplest form. What kills me now, standing in this library being accused of theft, is remembering how Grandpa used to ask about them. "Has your father called you this week?" He'd wonder aloud, and I'd have to gently remind him that Dad was busy, that everyone was busy, that life gets complicated. He'd nod slowly, like he understood, but I could see the disappointment behind his eyes. Not anger, just this quiet sadness that his own children and grandchildren only seemed to remember he existed when they needed something, or when obligatory calendar dates demanded it. Meanwhile, I was there every Sunday like clockwork, and sometimes Wednesdays too, when he'd text me asking if I wanted to watch his favorite old movies with him. The staff knew me by name, knew my coffee order, knew that I wasn't there for the spectacle, but for the man himself. The karma of this moment feels so twisted because I'd never wanted anything from him except his company, his stories, his wisdom that came from 8 decades of living fully. I never asked about the will, never hinted that I expected anything, never calculated my time with him against potential payback. But here's what nobody in this room understood. Grandpa saw everything. He watched who showed up when he was healthy and who disappeared when he got sick. He noticed who called to check on him versus who called to check on his assets. He kept mental notes of every birthday forgotten, every holiday skipped, every time someone was too busy, until suddenly they weren't when his health declined and the will became relevant. As Mr. Caldwell shuffled his papers and prepared to continue reading, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, Grandpa had seen this moment coming long before any of us did. 3 weeks before he died, Grandpa called me to his bedroom. Not the master suite everyone knew, but the smaller room he'd moved to when climbing stairs became too difficult. His hands trembled slightly as he poured us both tea, and I remember thinking how unfair it was that a man who'd commanded boardrooms and built empires now struggled with a simple teapot. "Sit down, sweetheart," he said, his voice raspier than usual. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear me." The afternoon light filtered through cream curtains, casting everything in this golden glow that felt almost sacred, and I knew whatever was coming would be important. He looked at me with eyes that had seen decades of human nature at its worst and best, and said words I'd replay in my mind 1,000 times. "They're going to come for you." I couldn't believe what he was suggesting at first, that my own family, the people I'd grown up with, would turn on me after he was gone. "Grandpa, that's not—" I started to protest, but he held up his hand, silencing me with a gentleness that somehow carried more authority than any shout could. "Listen to me," he continued, leaning forward with an intensity that made me forget how frail his body had become. "I've watched them, studied them like I used to study competitors in business, and I know exactly what's going to happen." He explained how betrayal often wears the mask of righteousness, how people justify their worst actions by convincing themselves they're the victims. "They'll paint you as the villain," he said, his voice steady despite the shocking nature of his words, "because that's easier than admitting they never really loved me. They loved what I could give them." The truth of his warning felt like ice water in my veins. But he wasn't done. "When they attack, and they will attack, don't fight the way they want you to fight," Grandpa told me, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "Don't scream, don't defend, don't beg them to see reason." His eyes held mine with such fierce love and protection that I felt like crying. But I held it together because he needed me to understand. "Let the truth speak for itself," he whispered, and there was something in his tone, something almost mischievous, that suggested he had a plan I couldn't yet see. I've spent my whole life learning that justice isn't loud. It's patient, methodical, inevitable. He talked about dignity and self-worth, about how real power comes from knowing who you are, regardless of what others say about you. What shocked me most was how specific his predictions were, like he'd already watched this movie and knew exactly how it would unfold. "They'll accuse you of taking advantage of me," he said with bitter accuracy, "of manipulating an old man who didn't know better." He actually laughed at that, this dry, knowing laugh that held no real humor, as if I built a billion-dollar empire by being easily manipulated. Then his face grew serious again, almost sad. "Your father will be the worst," he admitted, and I saw something break in his expression, the pain of a parent recognizing their child's true character and finding it lacking. "He'll choose greed over you, and that knowledge will hurt more than anything Brittany says." The prophecy felt too dark to be real, but sitting in that library now, watching it all unfold exactly as he'd predicted, I understood he'd been giving me armor for a war I didn't know was coming. His final words from that afternoon echoed in my mind as Brittany continued her performance of outrage. "Remember, sweetheart, vengeance isn't about becoming like them. It's about standing so firmly in the truth that their lies collapse under their own weight." He'd smiled then, tired but somehow triumphant, like a chess master who'd already seen 20 moves ahead. "I've made arrangements," he'd said cryptically, "and when the time comes, you'll understand why I needed you to be strong enough to stand alone first." I'd hugged him that day, breathed in his cologne mixed with the antiseptic smell of old age, and promised I'd remember everything he taught me. Now, standing accused in his library while his portrait watched from the wall, I realized his prophecy wasn't just a warning. It was preparation for a payback he'd orchestrated from beyond the grave. Mr. Caldwell adjusted his glasses and began reading the actual bequests, and I watched my family's faces transform from performative grief into barely concealed calculation. "To my son, Richard," he read in that measured attorney voice, "I leave the property in Vermont, with the condition that it cannot be sold for 10 years and must be maintained to historical preservation standards." My father's jaw tightened. He'd obviously been expecting liquid assets, not a money pit that required upkeep. The tension in the room shifted immediately, like someone had turned up the temperature, and I could practically see the dollar signs rearranging themselves behind everyone's eyes. This wasn't how they'd imagined this going, not at all, and the humiliation of their transparent disappointment would have been funny if it wasn't so sad. "To my daughter Margaret," Mr. Caldwell continued, and my aunt literally sat up straighter, "I leave my collection of first edition books, valued at approximately $80,000, with the requirement that they remain in the family and never be sold." You could hear her disappointment in the small gasp she tried to hide. 80,000 probably seemed like pocket change compared to what she'd been fantasizing about. My uncle whispered something sharp in her ear, and her perfectly applied makeup couldn't quite hide the flush of anger creeping up her neck. One by one, Mr. Caldwell read through bequests that all came with strings attached. The beach house that had to be shared among 3 cousins. The stock portfolio that was locked in a trust until certain conditions were met. The artwork that could only be donated to museums, never sold. Every single inheritance was designed to frustrate immediate gratification. And I couldn't believe how perfectly Grandpa had anticipated their greed. The truth started dawning on everyone simultaneously. This wasn't the windfall they'd expected. This was a test they were already failing. Brittany received Grandma's jewelry collection, but with a clause that required her to wear each piece at least once publicly before she could pass it down, essentially making it impossible to quietly pawn off. My younger brother Ethan got Grandpa's vintage car collection, but with mandatory insurance and storage costs that would eat into any value. Even the cash bequest came with limits. $25,000 per year for 5 years, contingent upon maintaining employment and submitting annual financial statements. The room felt like it was vibrating with suppressed rage. Everyone too well-bred to scream, but too disappointed to hide it completely. The shocking reality was setting in. Grandpa hadn't just distributed his wealth. He'd created a maze of conditions that revealed exactly what he thought of their character. What killed me was watching them do the mental math right there in front of his portrait, calculating whether fighting over these conditional inheritances was worth the effort. My father kept running his hands through his hair, a tell I'd known since childhood that meant he was trying to control his temper. My aunt's perfectly manicured nails tapped against her leather clutch in an anxious rhythm that betrayed her composed expression. Even the cousins who'd barely spoken to Grandpa in years were shifting uncomfortably, realizing that their fantasy of easy money was crumbling with every word Mr. Caldwell read. The betrayal they probably felt, thinking Grandpa had somehow cheated them out of what they deserved, was almost palpable. But here's what none of them understood yet. They'd never deserved it in the first place, and Grandpa had known that all along. Then Mr. Caldwell paused, took a slow sip of water, and said the words that made every single person in that room lean forward. And now, regarding the remainder of the estate, the energy shifted instantly, dangerously, because everyone knew what remainder meant. The real money, the liquid assets, the actual fortune that made my grandfather a name people recognized. This was the moment they'd all been waiting for, and you could feel the greed crystallizing into something almost predatory. Brittany's eyes flickered to me with such naked hatred that I actually took a step back, and my father's expression hardened into something I'd never seen before. Determination mixed with entitlement, mixed with something dark that made my stomach drop. Whatever was coming next, I realized, would determine whether this family drama turned into something far worse. The moment Mr. Caldwell mentioned the remainder of the estate, something primal shifted in that library. Every spine straightened, every breath held, every eye focused on the attorney's mouth with an intensity that would have been comical if it wasn't so terrifying. My father leaned forward so far he was practically hovering over the table. My aunt's hand clutched her husband's arm with white knuckles, and Brittany's perfectly glossed lips parted slightly in anticipation. This was the moment they'd been rehearsing in their minds for months, maybe years. The announcement that would change their lives, validate their patience, reward their performances of familial devotion. The shocking thing was how quickly they'd forgotten about the man we were supposedly mourning. Grandpa had become irrelevant the second his money became available. I couldn't believe how synchronized their movements were, like they'd practiced this choreography without even realizing it. Uncle James adjusted his tie. Aunt Margaret smoothed her dress. My father cleared his throat. All these tiny gestures of preparation, as if looking presentable would somehow influence what Mr. Caldwell was about to read. The atmosphere felt thick, suffocating, charged with the kind of tension that precedes violence or revelation. I stood there near the back of the room, still reeling from being called a thief, and watched my family transform into something I barely recognized. These were people I'd shared Thanksgiving dinners with, people who'd attended my graduation, people who'd once felt like safety, but right now they looked like strangers united only by a singular, consuming hunger for wealth that wasn't yet theirs. The truth is, I'd seen this behavior before in nature documentaries. The way predators circle and wait, conserving energy until the precise moment to strike. That's exactly what this felt like. Calculated, patient, ruthless. Brittany kept glancing at me with this expression that mixed triumph and contempt, like she'd already won a game I didn't know we were playing. My father wouldn't meet my eyes at all anymore, which somehow felt worse than Brittany's hatred, because at least hatred acknowledges your existence. His avoidance felt like erasure, like I'd already been written out of the family narrative, deleted from the story they were telling themselves about who deserved Grandpa's fortune. The betrayal of that realization hit different than Brittany's accusations. This was my own father choosing money over his daughter, before he even knew how much money was at stake. What shocked me most was the silence. Not peaceful, but predatory. The kind of quiet that comes before an attack. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved unnecessarily. They just waited with this collective focus that made my skin crawl. Mr. Caldwell seemed to sense it too, because he paused longer than necessary, his eyes scanning the room with what looked like professional curiosity, mixed with personal distaste. "Before I continue," he said slowly, deliberately, "I want to remind everyone that this is a legal proceeding, and all parties are expected to conduct themselves with appropriate decorum." It was a warning disguised as a reminder, and the fact that he felt the need to say it at all spoke volumes about what he anticipated coming next. They heard it too, but they didn't care. Decorum was a luxury they'd abandon the second their interests were threatened. I felt myself shrinking back against the bookshelf, trying to become invisible while simultaneously knowing that invisibility was exactly what they wanted from me. If I disappeared, if I just quietly accepted whatever scraps they decided to throw my way, maybe they'd let me leave with my dignity intact. But something in Grandpa's warning echoed in my mind. Don't fight the way they want you to fight. And I realized that backing down was exactly the fight they wanted, the surrender that would validate their narrative. So I straightened my spine, lifted my chin, and met Brittany's eyes directly, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. The vengeance in her expression intensified, like my refusal to cower had personally offended her, and I understood with chilling clarity that whatever came next, they'd already decided I was the enemy who needed to be eliminated from the equation of their inheritance. Brittany didn't wait for Mr. Caldwell to continue. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that made everyone flinch. "Before we go any further," she announced, her voice trembling with what she wanted everyone to believe was righteous anger, "I think we need to address the elephant in the room." Her finger pointed at me like a weapon, steady and accusatory, and I felt every pair of eyes swing in my direction. She'd been waiting for the remainder to make it official. "She stole from Grandpa," Brittany declared, and the way she said it, with such conviction, such practiced devastation, made it sound like an indisputable fact rather than the shocking lie it actually was. Family heirlooms, valuable pieces that were meant to be passed down through generations. And she took advantage of an elderly man who trusted her. The betrayal, I felt in that moment, wasn't just about the accusation. It was about how effortlessly she lied, how naturally the fiction rolled off her tongue. My father cleared his throat, and I actually felt hope for half a second. Maybe he'd defend me. Maybe blood would prove thicker than greed. But then he spoke, and that hope shattered like glass. "Brittany's right to bring this up," he said, his voice carrying this careful neutrality that was somehow worse than outright accusation. "We've all noticed items missing, and Julie was the only one with unrestricted access to Dad's private spaces." The way he said my name, Julie, like I was a stranger he was identifying in a police lineup, made my throat tighten. He wasn't asking if it was true, wasn't giving me the benefit of doubt. He was building a case, constructing a narrative where I was guilty before I'd even opened my mouth to defend myself. The humiliation of being condemned by my own father in front of the entire family felt like being backstabbed with a knife I'd never seen coming. I couldn't believe this was happening, that I was standing in my grandfather's library being treated like a criminal because I'd actually cared about him. "That's not true," I managed to say, my voice embarrassingly shaky. "I never took anything that wasn't," but Brittany cut me off with a performance worthy of an Oscar. "Wasn't what? Wasn't yours?" she interrupted, her voice rising. "Exactly. None of it was yours. But you manipulated Grandpa, made him think you were the only one who cared, isolated him from the rest of us so you could have free access to everything valuable. The shocking audacity of her accusations left me speechless. She was literally describing her own behavior and projecting it onto me. Every Sunday I'd spent with Grandpa, every genuine moment of connection, was being twisted into some calculated scheme for personal gain. The truth was being murdered right there in that library, stabbed to death by insinuations and half-truths that sounded plausible enough to convince people who wanted to be convinced. My aunt nodded along with Brittany's accusations, adding her own observations. She was always so eager to help him with paperwork, always asking to go into his study. Uncle James chimed in about how convenient it was that things went missing only after I'd started visiting regularly. Even Ethan, my own brother, sat there silent, neither defending me nor joining the attack, which somehow felt like its own form of betrayal. Ethan was 19, financially dependent on Dad, and terrified of becoming the next target. His silence was fear, not agreement, but it still hurt. They were building a case together, layering accusation upon accusation until the weight of their collective narrative threatened to crush the actual truth beneath it. The family drama had become a coordinated assault, and I was completely surrounded. What killed me most was how my father watched me struggle to defend myself, then used my defense as further evidence of guilt. "Notice how she's not denying having access," he pointed out to the room, as if I was on trial and he was the prosecutor. "Notice how she's trying to justify it, rather than simply proving her innocence." It was a trap. Everything I said would be twisted. Every explanation would become an excuse. Every truth would be reframed as a lie. I felt shamed in a way that went beyond embarrassment. This was character assassination, a deliberate attempt to destroy my reputation so thoroughly that nothing I said would matter. And as I looked around that room, at faces that had once smiled at me across dinner tables, I realized that Grandpa had been right about everything. They weren't coming for me because they believed I was a thief. They were calling me a thief because they needed a reason to come for me. Brittany wasn't finished destroying me. She was just getting started. "And we have proof," she announced dramatically, pulling out her phone like she was about to present Exhibit A in a murder trial. A pawn shop owner downtown confirmed that someone matching Julie's description came in 3 months ago trying to sell antique cufflinks. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs, and I felt my heart drop into my stomach because, yes, I had been to a pawn shop, but not for the reasons she was implying. The shocking thing was how she'd taken a grain of truth and twisted it into something unrecognizable, weaponizing my actual actions to support a completely fabricated narrative. Before I could even process what was happening, the entire family had already decided this was the smoking gun that proved my guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. I couldn't believe how fast the story was spiraling out of my control. "Wait, let me explain," I started, but my father held up his hand to silence me, which felt like being slapped across the face. "I think we've heard enough," he said coldly, and the finality in his tone made it clear that my explanations were unwelcome, my truth irrelevant. Brittany continued, emboldened by his support. Grandpa's vintage cufflinks, the ones from his father, the ones that were supposed to stay in the family. She tried to sell them for cash. The way she emphasized cash made it sound sordid, desperate, like I was some kind of addict pawning family treasures to feed a habit. The betrayal of watching her manufacture this narrative, knowing she was lying through her perfectly veneered teeth, made me want to scream. But I knew that any emotional reaction would only be used as further evidence of my guilt. The truth was so simple, so innocent. But in this room it sounded like a pathetic excuse, even to my own ears. "Grandpa asked me to take those cufflinks to the pawn shop," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady despite the humiliation burning through me. "He wanted to know their value for insurance purposes. He was updating his policy and needed current appraisals. He insisted we do it off record because he didn't want staff or family to know what was being insured." But even as the words left my mouth, I could see they weren't landing, weren't penetrating the wall of suspicion that had already been built around me. My aunt actually scoffed, and Uncle James muttered something about convenient stories under his breath. Brittany smiled, actually smiled, like I'd just proven her point by trying to defend myself. "Insurance purposes," she repeated mockingly. How convenient that you were the only witness to this supposed request. What shocked me was how quickly legitimate action could be reframed as criminal behavior when you controlled the narrative. I had gone to that pawn shop. I had asked about the cufflinks. I had been seen there. All facts, all true, all completely innocent in context, but damning when stripped of that context. It was brilliant in the most evil way possible. Brittany had found something verifiable and built a lie around it that was impossible to disprove without Grandpa here to confirm my story. And she knew it. I could see it in the way she stood there with false tears glistening in her eyes, playing the heartbroken granddaughter who'd just discovered her cousin's infidelity to family trust. The other relatives were nodding along, their faces a mixture of disappointment and vindication, like they'd suspected this all along and were relieved to finally have confirmation. My father delivered the final blow with surgical precision. The fact that you can't provide any documentation of this insurance appraisal pretty much says it all, doesn't it? His words hung in the air like poison. And I realized with sickening clarity that this wasn't about truth. This was about creating enough reasonable doubt to justify whatever they planned to do next. They didn't need proof that I was guilty. They just needed enough circumstantial evidence to make guilt seem plausible, to give themselves permission to treat me like a criminal. The karma of this moment felt crushing, because I'd been so careful to do everything right, to help Grandpa legitimately, to maintain my dignity and self-worth by never asking for anything, and somehow that very carefulness had left me vulnerable, with no paper trail to prove my innocence. As Mr. Caldwell opened his mouth to intervene, I saw Brittany's smile widen just slightly, and I knew that whatever she'd set in motion, she believed she'd already won. Mr. Caldwell stood up so abruptly that his chair rolled backward and hit the wall with a sharp crack that silenced the entire room. "That's enough," he said, and his voice carried an authority that made even my father pause mid-sentence. The attorney's face had transformed from professional neutrality into something harder, almost disgusted, as he looked around the library at my family's performance. "I've been practicing law for 37 years, he continued, each word deliberate and weighted, "and I've handled countless estate proceedings. But I have never, and I mean never, witnessed such a transparent display of coordinated character assassination." The shocking directness of his statement made Brittany's confident smile falter for the first time. "Your grandfather," Mr. Caldwell said, his eyes sweeping across every face in the room, "anticipated exactly this moment. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Grandpa had known, had actually predicted this entire scene would play out exactly like this." Mr. Caldwell walked to his briefcase with measured steps. The kind of deliberate movement that suggested what came next had been carefully planned and rehearsed. "Before his death, your grandfather came to my office with concerns about the integrity of certain family members," he explained, pulling out a sleek laptop that seemed almost anachronistic in this room full of antique furniture and old money. The truth was about to surface. I could feel it in the sudden tension that gripped the room, in the way Brittany's hand flew to her throat, in how my father's face drained of color. He instructed me that if, and I quote, "they try to destroy Julie's character to contest the will," I was to share certain evidence he'd collected. The laptop opened with a soft chime that sounded like a bell tolling for judgment. "Your grandfather installed security cameras throughout this mansion 2 years ago," Mr. Caldwell announced, and I watched the betrayal and panic flash across multiple faces simultaneously. The first visible cameras went in 2 years ago. After the first items vanished 8 months ago, Grandpa had me oversee discrete upgrades, hidden operational units installed last year. Not because he didn't trust his staff. He trusted them completely. But because he wanted to document the behavior of family members who visited. The attorney's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, and suddenly the large television mounted on the library wall, supposedly for video conferences, flickered to life. "What you're about to see are time-stamped, authenticated recordings from those cameras," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of imminent justice. "Your grandfather reviewed hours of footage himself and marked specific segments. What killed me was the sudden shift in the room's energy, from predatory confidence to cornered desperation in less than 30 seconds. Brittany stood up so fast her chair tipped over. You can't just, that's private property, there are laws about. She started babbling, but Mr. Caldwell cut her off with a look that could freeze fire. Your grandfather owned the property, installed the cameras with proper notification to staff, and had every legal right to record activity in his own home, he said calmly. These recordings were installed and preserved under counsel. Chain of custody is intact. My aunt looked like she might faint. Uncle James was furiously whispering to her, and my father's face had gone from pale to flushed red. The humiliation they'd tried so hard to force on me was about to boomerang back on them with devastating force. Mr. Caldwell's hand hovered over the keyboard, and he looked directly at me for the first time since this circus began. Julie, your grandfather wanted me to tell you something before we proceed, he said, his voice softening slightly. He said, let them think they've won. Let them show everyone who they really are. Then let the truth speak for itself. Tears burned behind my eyes because those were almost exactly the words Grandpa had told me in private, and hearing them repeated here, now, in front of the people who'd tried to destroy me, felt like he was in the room protecting me one last time. He also said, Mr. Caldwell continued, a slight smile touching his lips, that vengeance is a dish best served with irrefutable evidence and legal documentation. Then he pressed play, and the screen filled with a date stamp from 3 months ago, the same time period Brittany had mentioned about the pawn shop, and I watched my cousin's face go absolutely white as she realized what was about to be revealed. The screen showed Grandpa's study in perfect high-definition clarity, the timestamp reading 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday 3 months ago, when supposedly nobody was visiting the mansion. The room was dark except for a sliver of light from the hallway, and then a figure slipped through the doorway, feminine, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and desperately didn't want to be caught. My heart stopped when the figure moved closer to the camera, and the infrared captured her face perfectly. Brittany. Not me, not some stranger, but the same cousin who'd just spent 20 minutes accusing me of theft was right there on screen, literally committing the crime she'd attributed to me. The shocking audacity of it stole my breath. She hadn't just lied about me. She'd actually stolen the items and then blamed me for her own betrayal. I couldn't believe what I was watching, even though the evidence was right there in 4K resolution. Brittany moved through Grandpa's study like she'd rehearsed the route, going straight to the antique cabinet where he kept his most valuable personal items. Grandpa replaced the cabinet lock with a modern keyed system because items started disappearing, Mr. Caldwell explained. The key log shows Brittany had a spare key the whole time. She began methodically removing items. The vintage cufflinks she'd accused me of trying to pawn, an antique pocket watch, several sets of expensive pens, even Grandma's brooch that was supposed to have been missing for months. She worked quickly but carefully, placing each item into a designer handbag that probably cost more than what she was stealing, which made the whole thing even more grotesque. This wasn't desperation or need. This was pure greed, the infidelity of a granddaughter who valued objects more than the man who'd bought them. The truth playing out on that screen was more damning than any testimony could ever be. The camera captured everything. Brittany checking her phone for the time. Brittany pausing to look at Grandpa's favorite photograph of Grandma. Brittany's face completely devoid of guilt or hesitation as she systematically robbed her own grandfather while he slept upstairs. She started 8 months ago, Mr. Caldwell noted. Right after Grandpa's health decline made everyone suddenly available. The timestamp proved it wasn't a one-time impulse. The video was date-stamped, time-stamped, and according to the file name Mr. Caldwell had shown before pressing play, there were 17 similar recordings spanning the last 8 months. 17 times she'd snuck into his home in the middle of the night to steal from him. The humiliation on her face now was exquisite, a perfect mirror of what she'd tried to make me feel, and I would be lying if I said I didn't feel a surge of vindication watching her carefully constructed lies. What shocked everyone, including me, was when Brittany on the screen stopped mid-theft and glanced up at the obvious dome camera in the corner, the decorative one she knew about. She froze for a second, then smirked and blew it a kiss before continuing her theft. The arrogance of that gesture, the absolute certainty that she'd never face consequences, made several people in the room gasp audibly. She knew, my aunt whispered, horror and realization mixing in her voice. But Mr. Caldwell shook his head. That one was decorative, he corrected. She knew about the decorative cameras your grandfather had installed years ago. She didn't know about the operational ones he'd hidden last year. The real one was hidden above the bookshelf trim. Cameras so small and well concealed that even the cleaning staff couldn't find them without a map. The video continued playing, showing Brittany leaving the study with her bag full of stolen heirlooms. And then Mr. Caldwell clicked to another file. "This one is from the morning after," he explained. And suddenly we were watching the breakfast room where Brittany sat with Grandpa, eating French toast and laughing at something he'd said. The room's conference system had captured the audio crystal clear as she told him, "I'm so glad I could visit Grandpa. You know I'd be here every day if I could." The backstabbed look on everyone's faces, including mine, was visible in their reflections on the dark television screen. She'd stolen from him at night, and then shared breakfast with him in the morning, performing Granddaughter of the Year, while knowing exactly what she'd done. The karma of watching her exposed like this, after she'd tried so viciously to expose me with fabricated evidence, felt like watching justice unfold in real time. And I finally understood what Grandpa had meant about letting the truth speak. Just when I thought the shocking revelations were over, Mr. Caldwell's expression darkened even further. "There's more," he said quietly, and the way he looked at my father made my stomach drop before I even knew why. He clicked to another video file. This one dated just 2 weeks after Grandpa's funeral, and the timestamp showed it was recorded in the mansion's library. This very room where we were all sitting now. The screen filled with an image of Brittany and my father standing by the window, their heads close together in conversation, and the audio quality was so clear, you could hear the ice clinking in the crystal glasses they held. "We need to move fast," my father was saying, his voice carrying none of the grief he'd performed at the funeral. "The will reading is scheduled for next month, and we need our story straight before then." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own father, the man who'd raised me, was on video conspiring against me. Brittany's voice came through the speakers with chilling clarity. I already planted the pawnshop story. "My friend who works there will confirm Julie came in asking about the cufflinks." My father nodded approvingly, swirling his bourbon like they were discussing stock portfolios instead of destroying his daughter's reputation. "Good. That gives us the theft angle," he said. "But we need more. We need to establish undue influence. Make it look like she manipulated Dad when he was vulnerable, isolated him from the rest of us. The betrayal of hearing him plot my destruction was so visceral, I had to grip the back of a chair to stay standing. This wasn't spontaneous anger or grief-driven accusation. This was premeditated character assassination. The truth kept unspooling on that screen like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. "The beauty of it," Brittany said with a smile I could hear in her voice, "is that she actually did spend all that time with him. We just need to reframe it as calculated manipulation instead of genuine care." My father laughed, actually laughed, at that observation. "Exactly. We'll say she convinced him to change the will, isolated him from family, maybe even suggest she was stealing for months." He paused, took a sip of his drink, then added the part that made my blood run cold. "If we can get the will contested on grounds of undue influence, we can tie up the estate in litigation for years. Even if we don't win, Julie won't see a penny for so long that she'll eventually settle for whatever we offer just to end it." The shocking callousness of his plan, the casual way he discussed destroying his own daughter's life, made me question if I'd ever really known him at all. What killed me most was the financial calculation behind their conspiracy. Brittany pulled out her phone on the video and started reading numbers. If we can prove undue influence and get the court to invalidate his final will, it reverts to the previous version from 2019. In that one, the estate was divided equally among his children, with nothing specifically allocated to grandchildren. My father's eyes lit up like he'd just won the lottery. So instead of my share being diluted by conditions and trusts, I'd get a straight half of everything, roughly 40 million, give or take. Brittany nodded eagerly. And if Julie's portion gets frozen in litigation, we could potentially argue that her misconduct should disqualify her entirely, splitting her theoretical share among the innocent family members. They high-fived, actually high-fived, like this was a sports game they'd just won, instead of a plot to steal from their own family member. The video showed them rehearsing their accusations, workshopping which emotional beats would play best, discussing how to manipulate other family members into supporting their narrative. "Margaret will follow my lead," my father said confidently, referring to my aunt. "And James always does what Margaret says. The kids are easy. Just paint Julie as the outsider who manipulated their inheritance away." Brittany added her strategic insights. "We need to come across as reluctant accusers, like we're heartbroken to even suggest it. But the evidence is just too damning to ignore. The level of calculation, the theatrical planning of every emotional beat, revealed that today's performance in the library hadn't been spontaneous, grief-driven confrontation. It had been a carefully choreographed attack designed to justify their vengeance against someone who'd simply loved their grandfather authentically." As the video ended and the screen went dark, I looked at my father's face in the present moment and saw not shame or rem. The silence that followed the video's end was different from the predatory quiet that had filled the room earlier. This was the silence of total devastation, of worlds collapsing, of lies dying under the crushing weight of irrefutable truth. Nobody screamed, nobody protested, nobody even tried to defend themselves. Because what defense could possibly exist against their own recorded words, their own conspiratorial laughter, their own calculated cruelty caught in high-definition clarity? I watched my father's face cycle through emotions so rapidly it was almost fascinating. Shock, panic, anger, fear, and finally a kind of hollow resignation that made him look decades older in seconds. The humiliation he felt now was justice in its purest form. Not violence, not shouting, just the simple, devastating experience of being seen for exactly who he was. I couldn't believe the family's collective reaction. Or rather, their complete lack of one. Brittany sat frozen in her chair, her perfectly manicured hands trembling in her lap, all the theatrical confidence drained from her body like someone had pulled a plug. My Aunt Margaret stared at her own brother, my father, with an expression of dawning horror, as if she was only now realizing that she'd been manipulated into supporting a conspiracy she didn't fully understand. Uncle James looked furious, but his anger was directed at my father and Brittany now, not at me. And I could practically see him calculating how their scheme had put his own inheritance at risk. Even Ethan was staring at Dad with naked betrayal on his young face, finally understanding that our father had been willing to destroy his own daughter for money. The shocking thing was that nobody rushed to deny it. Nobody claimed the video was fake or taken out of context. They all knew truth when it punched them in the face. The truth had done what my words never could have. It had stripped away every pretense, every performance, every carefully constructed lie, and left nothing but raw, undeniable reality. My father had lost control of the narrative so completely that he couldn't even attempt to spin it. What could he possibly say? That the video lied? That his own voice discussing undue influence and tying up the estate in litigation meant something other than exactly what it sounded like? The legal terminology he'd used, the specific dollar amounts, the casual discussion of manipulating family members. All of it painted a picture so damning that silence was actually his best option. But silence, in this case, was confession. Every second he sat there without defending himself was another nail in the coffin of his credibility, his integrity, his relationship with every person in that room. What shocked me was seeing the exact moment my father realized he'd lost everything that mattered. Not the money, though that was clearly slipping through his fingers, but something deeper: respect, family, legacy. His own son was looking at him like he was a stranger. His sister was physically recoiling from him, and the family attorney's expression held nothing but professional contempt. This was a man who'd prided himself on his reputation, his standing in the community, his carefully cultivated image as a successful businessman and devoted father, and in the space of a 10-minute video, all of it had been revealed as performance. The karma of it was almost poetic. He'd tried to destroy my character to steal my inheritance, and instead he'd destroyed his own character and lost any moral claim to anything Grandpa might have left him. Brittany finally broke the silence with a sound that wasn't quite a word, more like a strangled sob mixed with a gasp. "I can explain," she started, but her voice cracked and died, because we all knew there was no explanation that would make this better. The woman who'd stood in this very room less than an hour ago, pointing her finger at me with such righteous conviction, calling me a thief and manipulator, had been caught red-handed committing the exact crimes she'd accused me of. The infidelity of it, the betrayal not just of Grandpa but of basic human decency, hung in the air like toxic smoke. Mr. Caldwell closed his laptop with a decisive click that sounded like a judge's gavel, and in that moment, I understood what Grandpa had meant about justice being patient and methodical. He'd let them plot, let them scheme, let them build their case against me, all while knowing that their own words would be the rope they'd hang themselves with. He didn't stop her immediately because he knew confronting her would trigger Mr. Caldwell's expression softened slightly as he reached for his laptop again. "Your grandfather recorded one final message," he said quietly, to be played after the evidence was presented. His fingers moved across the keyboard, and suddenly the screen filled with Grandpa's face, not frail and elderly like the last time I'd seen him, but recorded maybe 6 months before his death, when he still had color in his cheeks and that sharp intelligence burning in his eyes. "Hello, my dear family." His voice came through the speakers, and I felt tears immediately spring to my eyes because I'd thought I'd never hear that voice again. The shocking intimacy of it, hearing him speak after weeks of silence, made the room feel smaller, like he was actually there with us, watching everything unfold exactly as he'd predicted. I couldn't believe how steady his voice was, how clear his words, how completely sound of mind he appeared on that recording. "If you're watching this, it means my suspicions were correct. That some of you attempted to destroy Julie's character in order to contest my will," Grandpa said, and even through the video, I could hear the disappointment that weighted every syllable. "I want you to understand something. I loved you all. Every single one of you. I loved you when you were children, when you were young adults making mistakes, when you were grown people building your own lives." He paused, his eyes glistening slightly. But love doesn't mean blindness, and it certainly doesn't mean accepting betrayal as inevitable. The truth in his words hit like a physical force. This wasn't angry denouncement. This was heartbroken acknowledgement from a man who'd hoped his family would prove him wrong. The truth about what real love looked like was laid bare in his next words. "Julie," he said, looking directly into the camera like he could see me across time and death, "you showed me what it means to be loved without conditions, without calculations, without wondering what someone wants from you." My vision blurred with tears as he continued. "You came every Sunday not because you hoped I'd remember you in my will, but because you genuinely enjoyed my company. You helped me with tasks that had no monetary value. You listened to my stories even though you'd heard them before." His voice cracked slightly. "You gave me something I hadn't felt in years from most of my family. The certainty that I mattered as a person, not just as a source of inheritance." The dignity in his words, the self-worth he was affirming in me even from beyond the grave, made me feel simultaneously heartbroken and empowered. What shocked everyone was when Grandpa's expression hardened on screen, shifting from tender grandfather to the sharp businessman who'd built an empire. "To those of you who conspired against Julie, and yes, I knew about the conspiracy before I died, I simply wanted irrefutable documentation. You need to understand the full scope of my final will." He leaned forward slightly, and his eyes held that familiar glint of strategic thinking. "Most of my net worth is locked in companies, long-term holdings, and restricted assets. The liquid remainder, cash equivalents and unfettered investments, totals approximately $73 million. Julie will receive this, along with my primary residence and its contents, to be held under her control." The gasps around the room were audible, but Grandpa wasn't finished. "This isn't revenge," he clarified. "This is consequence. Julie earned this inheritance through authentic love and genuine care. The rest of you earned exactly what you received. Conditional inheritances, Desi." His final words carried the weight of both blessing and warning. "Julie, use this money wisely. Build something meaningful. Don't let their betrayal harden your heart. Let it sharpen your judgment instead." Then his face grew stern as he addressed the others. "For those who attempted to steal what isn't yours, you have 2 choices. Cooperate fully with Mr. Caldwell's investigation, return everything you've taken, and accept the inheritance you were actually given, or face the full weight of legal consequences I've already prepared. The evidence is documented, The legal framework is in place, and the choice is entirely yours." The video ended with Grandpa's face frozen in that expression of stern love, and the silence that followed was heavy with the realization that he'd orchestrated this entire moment from beyond the grave, not to hurt anyone, but to ensure that justice and truth prevailed over greed and deception. Mr. Caldwell let Grandpa's words settle for a moment before speaking again, his voice carrying the clinical precision of someone who'd rehearsed this part carefully. "Your grandfather was very specific about the consequences for those who attempted to subvert his wishes," he began, opening a thick legal binder that looked like it had been prepared months in advance. He established what he called the integrity clause, a provision that gives family members one opportunity to come clean, return stolen property, and cooperate with authorities. He explained carefully. Those who cooperate fully within 72 hours may be considered for prosecutorial leniency, though I should be clear that the final decision on criminal charges rests with the district attorney's office, not with this estate. The shocking thing was how thoroughly Grandpa had planned this, how every contingency had been considered and documented. This wasn't just an old man protecting his favorite granddaughter. This was a master strategist. I couldn't believe the level of detail in the framework Grandpa had created. Mr. Caldwell explained that every family member who'd participated in the conspiracy, or who'd knowingly benefited from stolen property, had exactly 72 hours to provide a complete accounting of their actions. This means returning any items taken from the estate, providing written statements about your involvement in planning or executing any scheme to contest the will, and signing affidavits acknowledging the validity of the final testament. He read directly from the document. Your cooperation will be shared with the authorities, and the prosecutor may consider leniency based on voluntary disclosure and restitution. However, I cannot guarantee immunity from criminal prosecution. That decision belongs to the state. The truth was becoming clear. Grandpa had built an off-ramp for them, a way to potentially avoid the worst consequences, but only if they were willing to admit what they'd done. It was justice with mercy. But the truth about consequences came next, and Mr. Caldwell's voice took on an even more serious tone. "However," he continued, looking directly at Brittany and my father, "any family member who refuses to cooperate, who attempts to retaliate against Julie, who destroys evidence, or who continues to contest the will despite the video documentation will face immediate legal action." He pulled out another document, this one stamped with official court seals. "Your grandfather filed preliminary paperwork before his death, essentially creating a legal framework that activates if certain conditions are met. Those conditions include continued harassment of Julie, attempts to tie up the estate in frivolous litigation, or public defamation of her character." The karma of it was exquisite. They'd planned to use the legal system against me, and Grandpa had preemptively weaponized that same system against them. What shocked me most was learning that Grandpa had thought of everything, down to protecting my emotional well-being and not just my financial interests. Additionally, Mr. Caldwell added, their bequests were held in trusts with a no-contest and anti-harassment forfeiture clause. Julie is authorized to seek restraining orders against any family member who attempts to contact her in a threatening manner, and any violation of those orders will result in immediate forfeiture of that person's entire inheritance. No conditions, no appeals, complete disinheritance. He looked around the room meaningfully. Your grandfather wanted to ensure that Julie could grieve, heal, and build her life without fear of revenge or retaliation from family members who feel entitled to money they didn't earn. The protective framework was stunning in its comprehensiveness. Grandpa had essentially built a legal fortress around me, anticipating every angle they might use to hurt me further. The final piece of the justice framework made everyone sit up straighter. Those who cooperate fully will face civil consequences, returning stolen property plus interest, paying for legal costs incurred, and accepting permanent modification of their inheritance terms, Mr. Caldwell explained. The prosecutor will receive documentation of your cooperation and may consider it when deciding whether to pursue charges. Those who refuse cooperation will face criminal prosecution recommendations, permanent disinheritance, and public exposure of their actions. He closed the binder with finality. Your grandfather didn't want to destroy his family, he said softly. but he refused to let his family destroy Julie. The choice of which outcome occurs is entirely in your hands. And you have 72 hours to decide. The payback Grandpa had orchestrated wasn't cruel. It was calibrated, giving everyone exactly the justice they'd earned based on their actions. And I finally understood that real power isn't about crushing Mr. Caldwell reached for his phone with a deliberateness that made everyone in the room tense. "There's one more element your grandfather insisted upon," he said, his finger hovering over the screen. Detective Whitaker was already assigned to this case because Grandpa filed a report while he was still alive. He documented the theft patterns and requested an investigation. Before anyone could process what he meant, he pressed a button and spoke clearly. "Detective Whitaker, we're ready for you now." The door to the library opened, and a woman in her 40s wearing a police badge and carrying a briefcase walked in with the confident stride of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. The shocking realization that law enforcement had been involved since before Grandpa's death, that this had escalated beyond family drama into actual criminal investigation, sent visible waves of panic across Brittany's and my father's faces. I couldn't believe Grandpa had coordinated with the police before he even died, but Detective Whitaker's introduction made it clear this was all perfectly legal and thoroughly planned. "I'm Detective Sarah Whitaker with the Financial Crimes Unit," she announced to the room, her voice professional and neutral. "This investigation was opened while your grandfather was still alive, based on documented theft patterns he reported. I've been working with Mr. Caldwell and reviewing the evidence provided by the deceased regarding potential theft and conspiracy." She opened her briefcase and pulled out official-looking documents. "Based on the video evidence, financial records, and witness statements already collected, I have probable cause to investigate several individuals in this room for grand larceny, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted theft by deception." The truth of how seriously Grandpa had taken their potential betrayal was stunning. He hadn't just documented their crimes, he'd built a prosecutable CA. The truth about legal protections extended to me specifically, and Detective Whitaker turned to address me directly. "Ms. Julie, I want to assure you that any attempts to intimidate you, threaten you, or coerce you into changing your testimony will be treated as separate criminal offenses," she said, her tone shifting to something warmer, almost protective. "Your grandfather was very clear that he feared his family might retaliate against you once the will was read, and he wanted you to know that harassment, stalking, defamation, or any form of violence will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." She handed me a card with her direct number. "If anyone contacts you in a threatening manner, you call me immediately. Not in a few days, not after thinking about it, immediately." The dignity and self-worth I felt in that moment, knowing that Grandpa had anticipated even my fear and had built protection around me, was overwhelming. What shocked everyone was when Detective Whitaker pulled out evidence bags from her briefcase. "I'm also here to facilitate the voluntary return of stolen property," she announced, looking directly at Brittany. "We know from the video evidence exactly which items were taken, and I have photographs and serial numbers for each piece. This gives you an opportunity to return them voluntarily and cooperate with the investigation, which the prosecutor may consider when deciding whether to file charges." Brittany's face went from pale to green, and I watched her internal calculation play out in real time. Admit to theft and return the items, or deny everything and face criminal charges with video evidence. "I should mention," Detective Whitaker added almost casually, "that we've already traced several items sold through a consignment broker 2 counties over. We've identified 3 separate occasions where items matching the description of stolen property were sold. The paper trail exists whether you cooperate or not." The legal framework was so airtight that even Uncle James, who'd been silent through most of this, looked impressed despite himself. Detective Whitaker laid out the next steps with brutal clarity. "Anyone who wishes to cooperate has 72 hours to provide a complete accounting of their actions, return all stolen property, and sign statements accepting the validity of the will. Those who cooperate will face civil penalties, and I'll recommend the prosecutor consider leniency, but I can't guarantee you'll avoid criminal prosecution entirely. That's the DA's call." She paused, letting that sink in. "Those who don't cooperate will be formally charged, arrested, and prosecuted. The evidence is overwhelming. The legal framework is solid, and quite frankly, Fighting this will cost you more in legal fees than any inheritance you might have received." Brittany's hands were shaking as she reached into her purse and pulled out a set of keys. "The items are in my apartment," she whispered, her voice completely strip. After Detective Whitaker left with Brittany's reluctant promise to return the stolen items, Mr. Caldwell reached into his briefcase one final time and pulled out a cream-colored envelope with my name written in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting. "Your grandfather left this for you," he said softly, handing it to me with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the legal precision he'd displayed all afternoon. "He asked that you read it privately, but also said you could share it if you felt moved to do so." My hands trembled as I took the envelope, feeling the weight of paper that somehow carried the weight of everything Grandpa had wanted to tell me, but couldn't say in person. The shocking intimacy of holding his last words, knowing that everyone in this room was watching me receive something they'd never get, made me feel both protected and exposed. I couldn't believe how much emotion hit me just from seeing his handwriting. The slightly shaky letters that came from age but still maintained that bold, confident style that had signed business contracts and birthday cards with equal care. I carefully opened the envelope, aware that every eye in the room was on me, and pulled out 2 pages of his personal stationery. "My dearest Julie," it began, and I had to blink away tears to keep reading. "If you're reading this, it means 2 things. I'm gone, and my family proved exactly who they are." The truth in those simple words felt like being seen and understood across the barrier of death. "I'm sorry you had to experience their betrayal firsthand. I'd hoped until my last breath that I was wrong about them. But I've learned that hope doesn't change character. It just postpones disappointment." The truth about what Grandpa really thought of my relationship with him poured out in words I'd never heard him say aloud. "You gave me something precious in my final years. The certainty that I was loved for myself, not my money," he wrote. "Every Sunday you showed up. I felt younger, more vital, more connected to what matters in life. You listened to an old man's stories. You laughed at jokes you'd heard before. You helped me feel like a person instead of a portfolio." His words blurred as tears filled my eyes. "When everyone else measured their love in future inheritance, you measured yours in present moments. That's a gift I can never repay, but I can try to honor it." He explained that the $73 million wasn't about money. It was about ensuring I had the resources to build a life that reflected my values, not their greed. What shocked me most was the specific guidance he offered, revealing that he'd thought deeply about what I should do with the inheritance. "Don't just spend this money, Julie. Transform it into meaning," he urged. "I've included a separate document with Mr. Caldwell outlining a foundation structure I'd like you to consider. Scholarships for students who can't afford college, legal aid for families fighting unfair inheritance disputes, support for elderly people whose families have abandoned them." The dignity in his vision took my breath away. He wasn't just giving me money, he was giving me a mission, a way to turn family drama and betrayal into something that could help others facing similar situations. "Turn our family's dysfunction into someone else's opportunity," he wrote. "That's how you win, not by destroying them, but by building something they could never imagine." His final paragraph held the wisdom I'd carry forever. "Remember what I told you. Don't let their betrayal harden you. Let it sharpen you. Don't become bitter. Become better," he wrote in slightly larger letters, like he was emphasizing every word. "Reclaim your self-worth, not by proving them wrong, but by living so fully, so authentically, so generously that their opinion becomes irrelevant." He signed it simply, "Your grandpa who loved you," and included a postscript that made me laugh through my tears. P.S. The 72-hour deadline wasn't random. I figured 3 days was enough time for guilt to work on a conscience, if they have one, but not enough time to lawyer up and create new schemes. Always control the timeline in negotiations. That's Business 101, which apparently I should have taught them better. I looked up from the letter to find even Mr. Caldwell smiling slightly, and I realized that Grandpa's final gift wasn't just money or protection. It was permission to move forward without the weight. 6 months after that devastating will reading, I stood in the grand ballroom of Grandpa's mansion, my mansion now, though I still couldn't quite believe it, watching 50 scholarship recipients celebrate their acceptance letters to colleges they'd thought were impossible dreams. The transformation of this space from a cold monument to wealth into a warm hub of opportunity felt like the truest form of revenge I could have taken. Not destroying my family, but proving that love and resources could build something they'd never imagined. The young woman standing in front of me, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her acceptance letter to medical school, represented everything Grandpa had envisioned. "I can't believe this is real," she whispered. And I smiled because I remembered feeling exactly that way 6 months ago when justice finally arrived. I couldn't believe how much had changed in such a short time. How quickly pain could transform into purpose when you had the resources and determination to make it happen. The library where I'd been publicly humiliated now held legal aid clinics every Tuesday, where families facing inheritance disputes could get free advice from attorneys I'd hired specifically for this purpose. The dining room where fake grief had been performed now hosted community dinners for elderly people whose families had abandoned them. Grandpa's portrait watched over these gatherings, and I liked to think he was smiling. The study where Brittany had been caught on camera stealing now served as my office, where I reviewed grant applications and planned new initiatives. Every room that had witnessed betrayal now witnessed healing, and the karma of that transformation felt more satisfying than any legal victory could have been. The truth about my family's response to the foundation varied wildly and revealed everything about their actual character. Brittany had returned the stolen items within 24 hours, signed every document Mr. Caldwell put in front of her, and provided a full written confession. She cooperated completely with Detective Whitaker's investigation, and as a result, the prosecutor agreed to civil penalties rather than criminal charges. She forfeited her entire inheritance from Grandpa, paid restitution and legal costs, and agreed to a no-contact order. Then she disappeared from my life completely. I heard through Ethan that she'd moved to another state, probably running from the shame of being exposed. My father had been more complicated. He'd also cooperated with the investigation and avoided criminal charges, but his inheritance was permanently restricted to the conditional Vermont property, stripped of any flexibility or control. He couldn't bring himself to apologize directly, instead sending formal letters through his attorney acknowledging his errors in judgment. Uncle James and Aunt Margaret had actually shown up at one of the foundation events, standing awkwardly in the corner until I'd approached them. "We're sorry," my aunt had whispered, and the shocking sincerity in her eyes suggested maybe some people could learn from their mistakes. They'd kept their conditional inheritances, but lost any moral authority in the family. What shocked me most was Ethan's transformation from silent bystander to active participant in the foundation's work. He'd appeared at my door 3 months after the will reading, holding a box of old photographs he'd found in storage, pictures of me and Grandpa from all those Sunday visits, evidence of a relationship the others had dismissed as manipulation. "I should have defended you," he'd said, his voice breaking. I was 19, scared of Dad, terrified of becoming his next target. But that's no excuse. I was a coward, and I'm sorry. Grandpa's letter had mentioned that showing up again is how you repair betrayal, that consistency matters more than apology, and Ethan had taken that to heart. He'd been volunteering at the foundation every week since, helping elderly clients navigate technology, listening to their stories, giving them the presence that our family had denied Grandpa. He told me once that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's absence, Ethan shared during one of our conversations. I was absent when you needed me, but I'm trying to show up now. The foundation had grown beyond anything I'd initially imagined, touching hundreds of lives and creating ripples of impact that would extend far into the future. We'd helped 23 families successfully defend against fraudulent inheritance claims, provided full scholarships to 38 students from low-income backgrounds, and created a senior companion program that matched volunteers with isolated elderly people in our community. Every person who benefited from Grandpa's money, my money now, used as he'd hoped, was a living testament to what happens when resources meet genuine care. The mansion that had once been a cold symbol of wealth had become a warm symbol of possibility, and standing in that transformed ballroom, watching young people celebrate opportunities they'd earned, I finally understood what Grandpa meant about sharpening instead of hardening. Their infidelity hadn't broken me. It had refined me, focused me, given me clarity about what actually mattered, and that clarity had built some 1 year to the day After that terrible will reading, I drove to the cemetery carrying a box of Grandpa's favorite lemon cookies from the bakery 3 towns over, the same ones I'd brought him every Sunday when he was alive. The marble headstone was simple, elegant, bearing just his name and dates with the inscription he'd chosen himself. He built much, but loved more. I sat down on the grass beside his grave, opened the box, and broke off a piece of cookie the way we used to share them during our afternoon talks. "You were right about everything," I said aloud, not caring if anyone thought I was crazy for talking to a headstone. "They came for me exactly like you said they would, and your plan worked exactly like you designed it to." The shocking thing was how much peace I felt now, how the betrayal that had nearly destroyed me had ultimately become the foundation for something beautiful. I couldn't believe how different I felt compared to a year ago, when I'd stood in that library being called a thief by people who'd actually stolen from the man we were supposed to be mourning. The truth had won, but not in the dramatic, explosive way I'd imagined. It had won quietly, methodically, through careful documentation and legal frameworks that Grandpa had built like he built everything, with precision, foresight, and an understanding of human nature that came from 8 decades of experience. The foundation helped its 200th person last week, I told him, brushing fallen leaves off his headstone. A grandmother whose children tried to declare her incompetent to steal her house. We got her the legal help she needed, and she won. Every success story felt like honoring his memory, like turning his pain about his own family's greed into someone else's protection. The truth about justice I'd learned wasn't about making people suffer. It was about making things right, about ensuring that consequences matched actions, about protecting the vulnerable from the predatory. Grandpa's elaborate plan hadn't been cruel revenge. It had been carefully calibrated accountability that gave everyone exactly what they'd earned. Brittany, who'd stolen and conspired, lost her inheritance entirely, and her reputation. My father, who'd plotted against his own daughter, kept only the most restrictive conditional inheritance, and lost his relationship with both his children. Ethan barely spoke to him now. The relatives who'd participated passively kept their bequests, but lived with the knowledge that they'd been complicit in attempted character assassination. And me? I'd received not just money, but purpose, protection, and the profound gift of knowing I'd been truly loved by someone who saw me clearly. What shocked me most was realizing that the greatest payback wasn't anything that happened to them. It was what happened to me. I'd built a life so full of meaning, so grounded in authentic values, so focused on genuine connection that their opinions had become completely irrelevant. They could think whatever they wanted about me. It didn't matter because I knew who I was. And more importantly, I knew who Grandpa had known me to be. The dignity and self-worth he'd affirmed in me had become armor that no accusation could penetrate. "You taught me that the opposite of betrayal isn't revenge," I said, placing a cookie on his headstone like an offering. "It's living so well that the betrayers become irrelevant." A breeze rustled through the cemetery trees, and I chose to believe it was his way of agreeing. As the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, I sat with the profound truth that had taken a year to fully understand. Real victory isn't about destroying your enemies, or even proving them wrong. It's about building a life so authentic, so generous, so grounded in truth, that nothing they say or do can shake its foundation. Grandpa hadn't just left me money or even justice. He'd left me a blueprint for transforming pain into purpose, humiliation into helping others, family drama into foundation for change. The cookies sat on his grave as the light faded, and I made him a promise. I'd keep building, keep helping, keep showing up for people the way I'd showed up for him. Because that, not the money, not the legal victories, not even the satisfaction of watching truth prevail, was the real inheritance. Love as action, not performance. Presence as proof, not promises. And truth as the unshakable ground on which to build a life that no amount of lies, greed, or betrayal could ever decay. So, here's what I need to know from you. Have you ever been backstabbed by the people who were supposed to protect you? Have you experienced that gut-wrenching moment when family chose money over loyalty, greed over love, lies over truth? Drop a comment below and tell me your story, because I know I'm not alone in this, and neither are you. What would you have done in my position When they called you a thief in front of everyone, would you have fought back immediately? Or would you have trusted that the truth would eventually speak for itself? And here's the real question that keeps me up at night. When you discover that the people closest to you have been plotting your destruction, how do you move forward without becoming exactly like them? I want to hear your perspective, your experiences, your wisdom about navigating family, betrayal, and finding justice without losing yourself in the process. Share your thoughts, your pain, your victories. Let's build a community where truth matters more than performance, and where we support each other through the shocking moments when the masks fall off and we see people for who they really are. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think or feel or recognize something in your own life, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because I'll keep sharing these real, raw, provocative stories about revenge, justice, and reclaiming your dignity when everything tries to strip it away. These aren't just stories. They're survival guides for anyone who's ever been humiliated, lied to, or cheated by people who should have known better. Let's continue this conversation together.